Okay, well, I think we're up, and the first thing I wanted to do is say you've been at Investigates for 9 out of 10 years, and the show just got nominated for this phenomenal award at the Canadian Screen Awards. Congratulations.
Thank you. It does feel really good. I always feel very lucky to be able to work with everybody else at Investigates and benefit from their experience and tell the stories they can tell. I'm glad that we can, the people of this country let us into their homes to tell these stories. So I always try and put myself behind the scenes, which is, I'm sure, a theme we're going to get to in a second. But I am glad that the show as a whole is getting this kind of recognition.
Yeah. And I wasn't here when you started at APTN. I was at APTN 2000, 2006. I left, I came back, and here you were. But do you remember how we met? Because we knew each other before I came back.
I don't. I am so sorry.
That's all right. We actually met on Twitter.
Oh, okay. This is going to be a journey for me because I don't remember this at all.
You were following me on the show. I was doing FAQMP,
yes.
And then I think there was particularly, and now I can't remember what it was. It was a Chiefs meeting that was happening in Ottawa. And
okay.
You were there, I think, along with a small portion of the team. But what I want to say is you had this Twitter handle, because I didn't know you were at APTN, because it didn't say APTN Josh or APTN Grummet or anything. Your Twitter handle is actually Josh Listens, which is a great Twitter handle for a reporter, but I don't know if that has anything to do with it.
It's not strictly about reporting, but more just life in general. I have always found that the most important thing I can do in any situation is listen. I've always found that whenever conflicts arise, when situations happen, if I just barge in and say what I feel, they're not going to get resolved in a good way. However, if I take the time and listen, and I try and understand where the other person is coming from and put myself in their shoes, I can resolve any situation and just live my life in a good way. I firmly believe the most important thing that anyone can do in any situation, journalism or not, is listen. So I put that in my Twitter handle as sort of a reminder to myself.
I always find that interesting what people call themselves on Twitter when they give themselves names. So I always wanted to ask you about that, and this was my first chance.
Well, I'm glad.
So I know that you went to Red River College, and you were freelancing for a while, but APTN became your first full-time job.
Yeah, that is a journey, but through connections at Creative Communications, I first began freelancing for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and the Manitoba Moose before the Winnipeg Jets came back on their...
That's more of the technical side then.
Yes.
Yeah.
On their Jumbotron cruise. So if you go to a Bombers game or a Moose game and you see what they put up on the Jumbotron, oftentimes I would have something to do with that. I'd be running the graphics, the videos, the attendance quizzes, things like that. And then when the Vancouver 2010 Olympics came along and APTN was part of the broadcast consortium for that, some of the producers that APTN hired as their unit producers had worked with me in those situations previously. APTN needed somebody who could run a program called Inscriber, which puts out the little font bars at the bottom of the screen, on their second shift as part of their crew, and those producers recommended me, and Ken Welsh brought me on at that time. And I got to APTN and I was like, this place is incredible. You treat your people right, everybody's fantastic to deal with. I'm going to try and stay here. So I sort of just busted my butt, and Ken Welsh luckily liked me enough from the Olympics contract to keep me on as casual through that summer. And through that summer, I would back up Russ Wells at the time on After Effects graphics. I would do editing, I would do shooting, and I was always sort of pushing Ken Welsh and Bob Macashon at the time and everyone else, being like, hey, I can do more. Hey, I can do more. Luckily, Investigates was working on its first summer special at the time, Ignored to Death, about the Brian Sinclair story. Right. And I sort of came to Paul Barnsley's attention as somebody who could do After Effects graphics. So he got in touch with me and brought me on, and I still remember this. He brings me up to a boardroom on the 5th floor, and the entire story is laid out in index cards. all of the facts. There's this grid of like 30 or 40, and I'm like,
oh my God, that's
this
so
is
Paul.
fascinating. So he's like, okay, where do you think we need graphics? And I'm like, this index card right here, let's just move this. And I ended up doing 3 After Effects graphics animations for Ignore to Death. And when a position at Investigates came open that fall, I applied, not thinking I had a hope in hell of getting it, because I hadn't done journalism since being at Red River in the creative communications program. But he saw something he liked in me. So would do the interview, get the call from HR later, and I'm all ready to go with an always the bridesmaid, never the bride joke. And it just dies on my tongue because Debbie Isaac says, we'd like to offer you the position at Investigates. And I'm like, sure, that sounds great. Thank you so much. And that was in the fall of 2010, and I've been here since.
Well, you know, it's one of the, I think it's one of the hiring secrets that maybe young journalists or people starting out need to know, because I was never told this, but when I moved up into management, I think it's how managers think about hiring. I know both Ken and Paul sort of have an eye for talent, but a lot of it's values-based. A lot of it's really, is this person share our sense of values, share our enthusiasm for what we're doing? So I'm sure that's what they saw in you. Yeah,
I had a moment of doubt where I asked Paul, this is quite the position. People don't normally go straight from college to National Investigative News Program. Are you sure you want me to do this? And his response was, all I know is you do what I tell you. When I tell you to do it, you do it on time and you do it well. So I'm like, okay, cool, I will go for this. And it has been the opportunity of my life.
Oh, you know, and you came on as VJ, but you've done a lot of shooting, you've done a lot of editing. We'll talk a little bit about reenactments later, but one of the things that I mean, Paul is very open about is he came from a print background into television, and figuring out television took that team a couple of years, because so many had a background in reporting or investigative reporting, but they were coming from print backgrounds, like Kathleen Martin's, Melissa Ridgden as well. So when you come on, and I mean, I think some of the shows were like that. A lot of the first shows were a lot of graphics, but then you're going out and you're collecting visuals. What do you think you contributed to the evolution of Investigates visually?
Oh, that's a question.
I do that to people.
You're good at it. It's tough for me to sort of take a 10,000-foot view on, because very often Paul and Kathleen and Melissa would simply rely on some of the insights we can provide. They would be like, we would have weekly meetings at that time, and they would say, okay, I've got this and this in this document, this and this explosive story. How do we tell pictures? And then, or how do we tell it visually? And then I put my hand up and I'm like, well, we can do a reenactment here. This part has a lot of stats. You're probably going to want a graphic. And it was just, I kind of grew with the team in that way, because I had a pure television, pure visual storytelling background, but I also had to learn how to talk to people who came from a print background. I had to understand that sometimes they were so fact-based that it's just, why aren't the facts good enough? But when you're telling a story visually, the big power of TV, the big thing television can give you is emotion. Combining pictures with music, with facts, lets you tell a story in such an emotionally punchy way that sometimes you need to take a step back and let the story tell itself. You need to function as someone who just frames the story. So I think bringing that perspective to Paul and Melissa and Kathleen, the primary print people with Investigates at the time, really helped us grow, and I'm glad I was able to do that.
And I'll say something that Investigates has done and has had to do, because sometimes they're coming at a story after the fact, and they do have to go do these reenactments, which really became something you were involved in. And initially, when I came on, I was worried about these, suspicious of these. I don't like reenactments because I feel like if you can't get the details right, you can get something wrong, you can misrepresent something. And I remember there were two of them that I was involved in. One of them, I think I was a character who was leaving the hospital in one story, and the other one was a piece that Jaden did. And I remember going over and saying, well, what about this? Did we know that there was alcohol at this party? Do we know that there was this many people there? Do we know? And everything, I was so impressed. Like, everything had been researched. You were absolutely sure every shot that you were putting on camera and you were showing was something that would have been present. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, eh?
Yeah, it's particularly important because there is always that ethical question. We cannot simply tell television stories where we let the camera roll for 23 minutes and put a couple of commercial breaks in it. We are always editing. Even Walter Murch, probably the most famous living editor, believes that we edit simply when we blink.
Yeah.
We edit our lives that way. So if everything is editing, it's the responsibility of the journalist and us when we're doing reenactments to make sure that what we do is tell the truth of the story. We're not here necessarily to communicate literally everything, but we have to communicate the truth of the story. And that means things like, for the reenactments you were working on, there were court documents in many cases that detailed what had happened. So we have to go through those court documents and say, okay, this happened here, the suspect was here at this part of the sidewalk when this happened. We have a responsibility to do that accurately. So yeah, I went through all of those court documents every time, because to do anything else does not tell the truth of the story.
Have you ever had a situation where you're looking and you don't know, or you think you have to take a shot out, or you have to deal with something where you have to show it in a different way because you can't get at the truth of what that picture should be?
Not to date. Mostly, there are two types of reenactments that we've done for Investigates. Either ones that heavily rely on court documents, and so we have at least a narrative, a truth that is there, that is presented for us, or we're doing something that appeared recently on our show Apprehended, which was about the experience of parents in Saskatchewan's, or with children in Saskatchewan's CFS system, where we can't illustrate the experiences of the children because they're in the CFS system. So what do? We do something that's abstract. We show a social worker coming to take a child away. And as long as we abstract it in the correct way and still tell the truth of the situation, then that's something that can apply to many different situations, which we had to do in that episode. There were 5 different parents who spoke to us anonymously. So I had to create something that would speak to the truth of each of them and their experiences. So those are the two types, the heavily factual ones, where there's lots of reporting, court documents, police reports that we can skew heavily towards and lean on, and the abstract ones that can tell the truth of any story, any individual experience, depending upon what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that all of us have worked in communities that are not their own. I've not always been working in Indigenous or Italian or women's stories. You know, I've gone into Muslim communities, Jewish communities, particularly when I was at Vision TV, Christian communities, and told those stories. And I had some of those, you know, it's funny because here I'll have non-native people say to me, well, like, do I have the right? Should we be telling these stories? And it's like, well, I don't think you can only tell stories from your own community, but it's a matter of respect. It's a matter of also realizing that you're the conduit for the story, right? It's not my story to tell. I'm the conduit that's going to help people get their story out, and it's just doing honor to the story. It's getting better at learning how to do that, I think, is probably the trick for all of us.
The importance of listening.
The importance of listening, Joss.
Just always trying to take a step back and understand that I'm not telling the story. The spotlight isn't on me. I'm the person framing the story. It's my job to be the conduit for this person to tell the story to Canada, to the television audience. And that has helped me a great deal. Seeing how Star Trek deals with people who have different lived experiences and othering has helped me a great deal in that. Always making sure to try and take a step back and have no ego and just be that framing device, be that conduit has helped me quite a great deal.
Well, I now want to get in a bit to the story that we're going to see. Now, I'll start out by saying, you know what? This is a story that in a million years I never would have done, and I never would have thought could have been done on television. It's got math in it. What were you thinking?
So every season of Investigates, prior to the current one, I would come up with 2 or 3 of my own pitches, and then I would always go to Paul and be like, okay, give me your biggest inside baseball story. I want your least filmable story. I want the story that has
Tell me why you would do that. Like, why would you even do that?
I love the challenge. I love the puzzle. And sometimes you can do a kind of alchemy, a kind of magic, where you take this completely unfilmable story on paper that's got math and principles from Italian people back in 1492 that apply, and like specific claims and comprehensive claims and all these legal terms nobody wants to define. But sometimes you can find a formula that helps tell that story in a good and powerful and useful way. And I always love the challenge of doing that. And Paul always has at least 5 of those stories that are like, I don't know what I'm going to do with pictures for this. So I'm like, okay, give me one of those. And Priceless was one of those.
Well, you know, I appreciate that because, Paul has over the years said, well, this story can't be done in television. I'm just like, you have to think about it, Paul. There's a way to tell it in television. You know, like you just have to find people.
Yeah.
That's all. And you start out with a person.
Yes. I feel like a person and a place, because the connection cannot be ignored. So Priceless is about the Huayet people, which I mispronounced and I'm terribly sorry, on Vancouver Island, and the Nonnative 1 reserve claim there. Back in the late 30s, early 40s, they entrusted logging rights to that reserve to the Canadian government to be like, okay, you can let companies come in and log here, because this is how things are done now, and you can give us some of the profits and make sure we get some of the work. But the Canadian government did not do that correctly. They breached the fiduciary trust of the Huayet. And decades and decades and decades later, that conflict has been resolved in a way that we find interesting. And the story, like what I had to do was be like, okay, how do I take this 1948 logging claim and turn it into television? Well, Chief Robert Dennis of the Huayet takes me on a tour of his people's land, of the Nonnative Reserve, and then I had it. This isn't just a story about math. This isn't just a story about legal processes. This is a nature documentary. I have to tell the story of this land, this beautiful valley, and everything that's happened that related to it. So by sort of melding that, by taking some of the legal stuff and combining it with the nature documentary of this valley, of taking the audience on the journey through this valley, you get to see why it matters. There's a point where I talk to Chief Robert Dennis and I say to him, this valley, this whole place does not look like it's worth $2.9 million or $14.5 million. This looks like it's worth billions. And he responds, yes, of course, it's worth more than that to us. It's part of our culture. So that inextricable connection helped me take the story from papers and legal documents and Paul looking at it with a worried expression to 23 minutes of television.
And okay, just a few things. We should get some definitions out of the way. Comprehensive land claim. There was never a deal. There was never a treaty. There was never a war or a battle. People just went in, took land, illegally stole it, shouldn't have done it.
Yep.
Specific claim, there was some agreement, and the agreement was breached.
Exactly.
And that creates the specific claim. Fiduciary responsibility, I think that we should go out and do something where we interview kids or something and ask them what a fiduciary responsibility is. I bet you all the First Nations kids would absolutely be able to, because we're ingrained with it. So government made us wards of the state, so it has a special responsibility towards us. So we set all this up, and then you go to peas.
Right. Okay, so...
As in a pod, peas,
when the Canadian government is paying back some of the damages it has caused to First Nations people, one of the things that we found when we looked into this was that they're using Canadian governmental principles, not the principles of First Nations, to pay them back. And often, those principles are derived from centuries-old settler traditions that maybe people haven't even thought about for a while. What in this case the Canadian government does is it uses something called the Pareto principle to determine how much it's going to pay back a First Nation. And Pareto was an Italian mathematician in the 1400s, I want to say, who noticed that 80% of the peas in his garden came from 20% of the pods. And he noticed that 80% of the nobles in Italy, or 20% of the people in Italy, the nobles, controlled 80% of the land. And somehow, this travels through the centuries. Insurance salesmen in the 1950s start using this as a principle for paying back claims. And the Canadian government, many decades later, says, you know, that's a great idea. That's a simple rule that we can apply to every First Nation across this country. Let's just start doing that. And they get a couple of court victories, which I'll come back to in a second, and it becomes an established precedent. So this, you know, European mathematical principle from centuries ago is supposed to apply to a First Nation in the 20th century and how they think about money and how they save.
Right. And how, I guess I understood it through your piece, was that you would go out and you would have, like, you give me $1. And I say, well, you know what, I'm only going to pay you back 20 cents because 80 of that cents of that dollar you would have just wasted anyway. So I really only owe you the 20 cents. That's kind of how they're settling land claims.
That very much is. The difference between simple and compound interest, which I'm not going to, you know, steal from my own piece. I recommend watching it, but I do go into the fact that the Canadian government would require First Nations at the time to put 90% of what they made into a trust fund and only spend 10%. But if the Canadian government breached its fiduciary duty, made a mistake, had to pay things back, they would only pay it back as though the First Nation had saved 20%, which is quite the discrepancy.
So this is now where the math all becomes like exceptionally interesting. And I don't want to give away the piece either. But sort of at the end of the piece, because now it sat there for a year and a bit, what is happening since then in the world of claims?
I have not seen much happen. And perhaps this is because specific claims moves quite slowly. The other reason, which this part I will happily spoil my piece on.
They move quite slowly, and there's only 50% of them that are ever resolved.
So
that's 1-5, in case somebody heard 5-0. It's 1-5, 15.
Got to be careful about the math today. The other reason is, I think, one of the things that attracted Paul's and my interest to the story, and that was the fact that the Canadian government said, okay, you know, this new model of compensating specific claims, that's fine, this works fine, we want to reconcile. And the Canadian government usually does not simply accept what the First Nation has put forward in that way. So we looked at this, and we're like, why did Ottawa roll over to, for lack of a better term, on this one? And we found that it was because if the Huayet claim had been fought up to the provincial courts and up to the Supreme Courts, then all of a sudden, the model that was used gets applied to more and more specific claims.
Right, it creates a precedent, right?
It creates a precedent. And when you see the monumental difference between what the Canadian government thought it should compensate the Huayet for and what the Huayet actually got compensated for, and then you take that and you apply it to every claim across Canada, covering breaches for hundreds of years, that's like we're into the trillions of dollars. So it becomes a huge precedent.
And so I think we're going to wrap it up there, but that goes to show you that math has a place in journalism.
It does. Terrifyingly, I still doubt my ability to execute it sometimes, but yes, it does, and it certainly came to play here.
Thank you so much, Josh, and congratulations again on the nomination. I hope you win.
Thank you. I hope the team does too. I think we really have put in a lot of good work over the last 10 years, so fingers crossed.
Thanks so much.
No problem.